My brother Sam is dead. Chapter 12. In June of that year, 1777, we found out that Father was dead. He'd been dead for a month. It had happened pretty much as we'd guessed it. He'd been sent to a prison ship in New York. There was one funny thing about it, though. It wasn't a rebel prison ship, it was a British one. We never did figure out how that had happened. It had just come out of the confusion of the war somehow. It didn't much matter in the end, though. Those prison ships were terrible places, filthy and baking hot in summer and freezing in winter, and of course nothing but slop to eat. The worst part was disease. If anybody got sick with anything serious, everybody on the ship was liable to get it. That's what had happened to Father. They'd had an epidemic of cholera on the prison ship he'd been on. About 40 or 50 people had died of it, and he'd been one of them. They buried him someplace on Long Island, but they weren't sure where. Mother said, after the war, we'll find out where he lies and have a headstone made for him. But I don't think even she believed we'd be able to do that. We found out all this from one of the men who'd been taken away during the raid on Reading that spring. He'd been put in the same ship, and he'd been with Father when he died. Before he died, he asked me to make sure you knew what had happened. He said, tell them that I love them and say that I forgave Sam. He's a brave boy, but he's headstrong. The last thing he said was, and now I go to enjoy the freedom war has brought me. But Father wasn't the only one who died. 2 days after we found out about Father, Betsy Reed came down to the tavern. I gave her a pot of beer. Did you hear about Jeremiah Sanford, she said. No, I said. He's dead, she said. Jerry? He's dead? Nobody understands it. They put him on a prison ship and he got sick and died in 3 weeks. It doesn't make any sense. You can understand why they took Mr. Rogers or Captain Betts, but why imprison a 10-year-old boy? What harm could he have done them? This war has turned men into animals, Mother said. They sunk his body in Long Island Sound in a weighted sack, Betsy said, so his parents can't even get him back. I don't understand it. What did they want him for? They're animals now. They're all beasts, Mother said. I think they are, Betsy said. Sam should have come home. It was the first time I'd ever heard her say anything against Sam and his ideals. I told him that, I said. He said he'd taken a pledge with some friends to stick it out until they won. Does he still think they're going to win, Betsy said. Well, maybe they will, I said. Betsy shook her head. Even Father says things are bad for the Patriots. I looked at her curiously. Don't you want them to win? I don't care who wins anymore. I just want it to be over. Well, Sam wouldn't want you to talk like that. I don't care, she said. When I see him, I'm going to tell him. For 3 years they've been fighting, and all we've had is death and hunger. Your father is dead. Jeremiah Sanford is dead. Sam Barlow is dead. David Fairchild is dead. Stephen Fairchild was wounded, and more. My father nodded. My mother nodded. Right at the beginning, life said it would be that way. He said, in war, the dead pay the debts for the living, but he didn't think he would have to pay himself. So Father had forgiven Sam, and I think Mother did, although she never said so. But for myself, I wasn't sure. I knew I'd be glad to see him and have him at home, but still, I felt it was partly his fault that Father had died. Oh, he hadn't captured Father or thrown him in prison or given him cholera or anything like that, but he was fighting on their side, and I couldn't easily forget about that. Yet, of course, it was a British prison ship he died on. It seemed to me that everybody was to blame, and I decided that I wasn't going to be on anybody's side anymore. Neither one of them was right. So summer passed, and it became winter once more, and people were suffering worse than ever from want. Luckily, there wasn't any more fighting around Reading. Anyway, in the winter, they didn't fight much. Nobody liked to fight in the cold, and when there was snow on the ground, it was hard to march and easy to get sick. The Continental Army was encamped at a place called Valley Forge in Pennsylvania somewhere. We didn't know whether Sam was there or not. From what we'd heard, they were practically starving and hadn't any clothes. I was just as glad. It made me hope that the rebels were at the end of their rope and would have to give up pretty soon and end this terrible war. I didn't even mind that Sam might be suffering with cold and hunger. It would serve him right. We were pretty hungry ourselves. Sam began writing us letters every once in a while. Every 2 or 3 months, especially after he heard that Father was dead. He didn't tell us where he was in his letters. Mostly they'd be about places he had been. Sometimes Betsy Reed would get a letter from him too, and she'd come down to tell us about it. So time passed. The year 1777 ended and 1778 began. Spring came, then summer and fall, and we harvested. Oh, how I hated the war. All of life was like running on a treadmill. I was 14. I should have been going to school all this while and learning something. Maybe by this time I would have begun to think about going to New Haven to study at Yale. I wasn't much interested in Latin or Greek, but in the last couple of years I'd learned a lot about buying and selling and the tavern business, and I wanted to study calculating and surveying and the agricultural sciences. I thought I might have a career in business. I might apprentice myself to a merchant in New Haven or New York or even London to learn the art of trade. Sam owed it to me to come home and help Mother run the tavern for a couple of years while I started to make my way in the world. But until the war ended, there was nothing for me to do but tread water. Prices kept on spiraling upward, merchandise grew shorter and shorter in supply, and everybody seemed to be in debt. You couldn't refuse a hungry widow who'd lost her husband in the war some cloth or molasses on credit. But then, how could we pay for new merchandise ourselves? We couldn't get over to Verplank's Point that fall. The rebels were holding all of northern Westchester County. Peekskill, Verplank's, Crompton, all of it. There was no way for us to get any cattle through. There wasn't much cattle around anyway. Bit by bit, people had begun slaughtering their stock for food. However, Mother and I had been able to get a hold of 8 scrawny cows, mainly from people who owed us a lot of money. There wasn't much to them, but with food in short supply, I figured we could get a pretty good price for them if we could get them to a British commissary somewhere. Not that I cared which side we sold them to, but the British were the ones who had money. They had the whole English exchequer behind them. The Continentals were paying off in commissary scrip, which would be totally worthless if they lost. I had heard that there was a British commissary in White Plains, which was about 25 miles southwest across the New York state line. I figured I might be able to drive the cattle down there through the woods. It would be very risky, but better than going hungry. And we needed some money to buy goods to keep the tavern and the store going. If the business died, we'd really be out of luck. Hunger is a pretty terrible thing. It's like going around all day with a nail in your shoe. You try to put it out of your mind, but you never really quite forget it. And when something reminds you of it, like reading about a big meal in a story or seeing a stack of bread, it really hurts. I mean, it just plain hurts. It makes you feel weak, and you get sick easily, too. That winter, everybody had colds and went around sniffling most of the time. Some people got really sick, and then their families would have to scrape up extra food to feed them with. Oh, I don't mean that people were dying from hunger. Nobody was actually starving to death, but most were hungry a lot of the time. All through November, I tried to find out about the British commissary, whether it really existed or not, or where it actually was. But I couldn't find out anything I really trusted. It was all rumors. The commissary was at White Plains. No, it wasn't at White Plains. It was Horseneck. Yes, it was at White Plains after all, but the rebels had it under siege, and so forth. I didn't want to go until I was sure. And if I ran into rebels, I'd lose the cattle and probably be put in prison myself. It was only worth the risk if I were sure just where the commissary was. Otherwise, we might just as well as eat the cattle ourselves. So, that was the situation on December 3rd, 1778, when Sam came back to Reading. That morning, he walked into the tavern. He looked thin and tired. There were black circles under his eyes, and his uniform was torn in about 6 places. He'd lost his belt, was wearing a piece of rope around his waist, and his hat wasn't an army hat, but just an ordinary fur cap. But he was glad to be home and grinning. "Hello, everybody," he said. Mother was out in the kitchen, and I had been stoking up the fire. "Sam," I shouted. "Mother, Sam's here." She burst into the tavern and began to hug him, and I hugged him too. And then he crouched down in front of the fire and ate a bowl of porridge with honey that Mother brought him. "This is the first time I've been warm for a week," he said. So we asked him all the natural questions, where he'd been and where he was going and so forth. "I'm going to be in Reading for a while," he said. "General Putnam is bringing a couple of regiments here for winter encampment. We're going up to Lonetown and hold up till spring." "Well, what's the idea of that?" "Well, the rumor is that we are supposed to be situated to move either west to the Hudson or south to Long Island Sound in case of a British attack either place. Some say we're mainly here to watch over the magazines at Middletown. I don't know. Those are the rumors, but we're building huts, so I guess we'll be here for a while. How did you get off? I've had a bit of luck. Colonel Parsons, Samuel Holden Parsons, that is, has moved into the Betts house. An adjutant came around and asked if any of us were from this area, and I said I was. And Colonel Parsons brought me into town this morning to show him around. Sam grinned, to the ladies mostly. I told him there weren't any ladies in Reading except my mother and my girl. He said they would do, so, Mother, you better put on your best dress. Mother smiled, but I don't think she thought it was very funny. You're so thin, Sam, she said. Are the troops all starving? Everybody in the country is hungry, he said. It's going to be worse than this winter, too. Have you got any cattle, Tim? I was proud that he asked me instead of Mother. 8, I said. They're not much to look at. Butcher them and hide the meat, or sell it. You can get a good price for the hides from the troops. Sell what you can. I promise you the stock will be stolen. Mother frowned. You mean your troops are stealing from your own people? Starving man will steal food from babies. He shook his head. There's a lot you don't understand. All of us have seen good friends killed. I had a friend bayoneted, and it took him 6 hours to die, screaming all the while. All we could do was hold his hand and wait. I saw a captain I loved blown in half by a cannonball. He was the best officer we'd ever had. He worried about his men. He put them first. He never ate before we were fed. And I've seen him go without to give his position to a sick man, his portion to a sick man. The redcoats blew him in half, right into 2 pieces, with his guts dangling out of both parts. He shivered. After a few things like that, you don't give a damn for anybody but your friends anymore. You kill redcoats the way you butcher pigs. The troops know that Reading is a Tory town. As far as they're concerned, stealing cattle from Tories is getting revenge. Sure, lots of them would steal from anybody, whether they were Tories or Patriots or anything else. Some are unscrupulous when they're hungry, and some are unscrupulous by nature, and they'll take whatever they think they can get away with. Of course, the majority of men are honest and won't steal, but if they decide you're Tories, they'll have no compunction about taking your beef. And let me tell you, it's pretty easy to decide somebody's a Tory when you haven't eaten anything but hardtack and pork fat for weeks. I've done it myself. Sam, I won't apologize. War turns men into animals, Mother said. I was ashamed of it afterwards, Sam said, but not very, and my belly was full. He nodded slowly. Tim, butcher the cattle. Let the meat freeze and hide it in the loft under the hay until you need it. He glanced out the window toward the Betts house. I better go. Colonel Parsons may be waiting for me. Don't go yet, Sam, Mother said. We've just seen you. I'll be around all winter, Mother. Maybe I can get attached to Colonel Parsons' staff. I'll try to get a pass if I can. Anyway, I can always slip out at night. It's risky. Colonel Parsons is not harsh, but General Putnam is in charge. He's a great patriot, but he's rough and tough on men who shirk their duty. 100 lashes for desertion, and if there's too much of it, I know he'll hang some people as an example. That's the kind of man he is. But I'll be back to visit again, one way or another. He left. We walked out into the yard with him, and he crossed over to the Betts' house and went back in. He's so thin, Mother said. I worry that he'll get sick. I couldn't bear to lose another, Tim. All at once she began to sob. It only lasted 10 seconds. Then she turned and went into the house, and when I went in a minute later, she was calmly scrubbing some beets. After December 3rd, we began to get used to the sight of soldiers constantly around town. There were always messengers going back and trains going by, and trains of supply wagons crunching over the snow, and sometimes groups of soldiers on work parties would appear at the tavern for beer. Having the troops around was good for business. Some of the officers lodged in houses around about. Often in the evening they came to the tavern to play cards and drink or smoke. Business was good, or rather it would have been good if we had had anything to sell, and people had had anything to pay for it with besides commissary scrip. Biggest demand was for liquor. Life at the encampment was cold and miserable, and the only relief for them was drinking. They didn't care what it was, rum, whiskey, cider, anything we could get. Whiskey was pretty hard to get. The General Assembly had made it illegal to distill whiskey because it was made from grain, and grain was needed for food. Rum was easier to get, and we could usually get cider because every farmer made it. I spent a lot of time riding around among the farmers buying whatever they had. They'd often have rum they'd taken in trade for livestock. I could offer them good prices for liquor because we would get good prices for it. The officers didn't care how much they paid for liquor. As they said when they were drinking, a short life but a merry one. Which of them knew when he was going to die? Of course, the ordinary soldiers didn't have much fun. For one thing, there was always the snow. It came down in a great blizzard about a week after the troops had started to build the encampment. Their huts were not finished, and they were forced to work in bitter cold and storm. The cold was a problem. The huts were really just tiny log cabins with big stone fireplaces making the whole rear wall. In cold weather, they had a lot of trouble getting the mortar to set. Because of this, the chimneys leaked so badly that half the smoke blew back into the room. The snow made hewing wood difficult too. Sam told us that they were having an awful time getting the huts finished. Even when they were done, they weren't much to live in. 12 soldiers jammed into a 14 by 16 room, breathing more smoke than air, and having to stumble over people whenever they wanted to move around. And the snow never stopped falling. By January, it covered the countryside 3 feet deep, so that the stone walls disappeared. You could drive a sled over the snow anywhere you wanted without paying attention to where the roads were. Sam was able to get back into town every week or 10 days. Colonel Parsons used him as a messenger a lot because he knew his way around Reading. Sometimes he would come in with the commissary officer looking for lime or nails or leather or all of the hundreds of things armies need. The idea was that Sam might know who had things. Often he'd come into the tavern and ask me if I knew who had hay or sleds or something else to sell. To be honest, I felt uneasy telling him about such things. The commissary people always paid for whatever they bought, but it was usually in scrip, and on top of it, the farmer didn't have much choice about selling or not. But I couldn't bring myself to lie to Sam. It was something I'd never done. All the time, Sam was after us to butcher the cattle. I didn't know what to do. The idea of selling them to the British was gone. With all the rebel troops around, it was too risky trying to move cattle anywhere. Besides, it would have been next to impossible in that deep snow. Still, I kept hoping that I could find someone who'd offer me a good deal for them. But Sam was pressing me. I'm warning you, Tim, sooner or later, somebody's going to get them. Well, I thought General Putnam gave strict orders against stealing. Oh, he did, and knowing General Putnam, he'll hang any soldier who he catches stealing. He's tough as nails, but he's honest. Besides, he wants the people to come around to our side, and if he lets the troops forage, he'll lose all sympathy with the populace. Oh, I know him. He's had a lot of men flogged already for disobeying orders, and I'm sure he's just itching to catch somebody stealing so he can make an example of him. Well, then what's the worry? Don't be stupid, Tim. A lot of men will take a chance anyway, especially when they're drunk. You wait, sooner or later, they'll get into your beef if you don't watch it. Mother and I kept churning it around between us. She figured Sam was right. You know what happened to Sally Miles's heifer? Mrs. Miles was a widow who had lived alone in a tiny hovel in Reading. She had a few tough chickens and one scrawny cow. She kept going mostly by selling milk and eggs to the people around. A few days earlier, a half-dozen drunken soldiers had noticed her cow in the barn, butchered it right there, and carried the slabs of beef back to the encampment in the dark. I know, I said, but the thing we need most is rum, and the only way to pay for it is with cattle. That was the beginning of January. We decided to stick it out through the month. There was a rumor going around that the British were forming up in New York City and were going to raid towns on Long Island. What that meant, nobody knew, but some believed that the men from the encampment would be called down from there to fight. I just couldn't make up my mind. The weeks went by. There was nothing anybody wanted but to get through this terrible winter. It didn't seem that the war could really go on much longer. Even Sam thought it would have to end soon. We talked about it one evening when he was there for a short visit. We were sitting in front of the taproom fire one night in late January. I think something decisive will happen in the spring, he said. The English government realizes by now that they're not going to beat us easily. Well, maybe they figure you're too starved and tired to fight much longer. He shook his head seriously. They might be right, he said. The other day, some of the men were actually talking mutiny. A lot of them have no blankets, they're short of food, and the pay hasn't come through. A bunch of them decided to march to Hartford and demand their pay. They were about to start out when General Putnam rode up and talked them out of it. Then he had a couple of the ringleaders shot right there. He shows no mercy when he thinks he's right. Suddenly he stopped talking. What was that? I'd heard it too, a kind of thump, and then a cow bawling. We listened. There were noises coming from outside somewhere. Sounds like something bothering the cattle, I said. There are people out there, Sam shouted. Let's go! We ran out through the kitchen toward the barn. It was dark, but there was nearly a full moon reflected on the snow, and plenty enough light to see what had happened. The barn doors were open. 2 cows were standing in front of the barn blinking, and we could see 2 more behind. We dashed into the barn. 4 of the cows were gone. Jesus, damn, I shouted. Pen 'em up, Sam shouted. They'll be butchering the others somewhere near. There's no chance of driving them very far in this snow. He darted around the house toward the road, his eyes following the hoof prints in the snow. I snatched up a shovel and drove the remaining 4 cattle back into the barn with the handle. They were bulky, and it took me a few minutes to get them inside and the door shut and latched. Then I raced across the snow, around the house to the road. There I stopped and swung my eyes across the horizon. I saw nothing, but distantly I heard the noise of shouting off toward the far end of the training ground. I ran in the direction of the sounds, and then suddenly I saw 3 men walking toward me through the moonlight, side by side. I stopped and waited. They came up. The one in the middle was Sam. His nose was bleeding, and there was a cut in his chin. His hands were tied behind his back. I stood in the open white snow field, surrounded by shadowy trees. Sam, I shouted. Timmy, get Colonel Parsons, he cried. They're taking me in as a cattle thief. I went cold. Then I turned and ran.